Welcome to another thrilling reverse harem werewolf romance audiobook, The Alpha's Claim. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating werewolf romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. We're excited to have you here again. Let's dive into another unforgettable tale. Act 1. The Girl with the Wolf Dreams. The air smelled of burning fur, blood and death. Elara stood barefoot on scorched earth, the heat licking at her skin, thick smoke curling in the sky like dying prayers. The bodies of massive wolves lay twisted and broken around her, their once powerful forms nothing but ash and ruin. In front of her, a woman stood wrapped in silver flames, hair white as the moon, eyes a terrifying shade of luminous blue. Power pulsed from her, raw and unrelenting. Goddess, monster, both. A deep, rich voice echoed the battlefield, a whisper and a promise all at once. You should have never returned. The flames roared, swallowing everything. Elara bolted upright, gasping for air, her pulse a frantic hammer in her chest. Jesus. Not again. She shoved the tangled sheets off her sweat-dampened body, her breathing uneven. Third time this week. Third time she'd woken up to the same goddamn nightmare. And every time, the details felt more vivid, more real. Her apartment was still dark, the cheap fan overhead creaking as it spun lazily. A muffled car horn blared outside, a reminder that the real world, the one with shitty paychecks and broken-down cars, was still there, waiting for her. Raking her fingers through her sleep-mussed dark hair, she muttered, "It's just a dream. Just a dream." But it didn't feel like just a dream. She exhaled hard, rolling out of bed and stretching, the ache in her lower back a reminder that her mattress was absolute garbage. Her boss, Marty, was still dragging his feet on paying her what he owed, so a new one wasn't happening anytime soon. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Mia, babe. Ooh, alive?" Elara smirked, typing back. Elara, unfortunately, wanna trade shifts. Mia, LOL. No thanks. Have fun with grease-stained pervs. Shoving the phone to her back pocket, she trudged toward the bathroom, peeling off her oversized sleep shirt and stepping into the shower. The lukewarm water hit her skin, washing away the sweat, but doing nothing to erase the unease clinging to her bones. The silver-haired woman from her dreams wasn't just a hallucination. She wasn't some random nightmare from binge-watching bad horror movies before bed. She felt familiar. Like a memory she shouldn't have. By the time Elara made it to Marty's diner, the late morning heat was already turning the cracked pavement into a stovetop. She pushed the glass door open, the faint scent of burnt coffee and grilled bacon wrapping around her like a heavy coat. Marty, a man who looked like he'd been smoking since birth, glanced up from behind the counter, his tired eyes narrowing. "You're late. You're underpaying me." "Guess we're both disappointed." Elara shot back, tying her apron around her waist. Mia, already behind the counter, stifled a laugh. "Sass this early? You're on fire, girl." Elara rolled her eyes, grabbing a coffee pot. "You have no idea." Before she could pour, the bell above the door jingled. A group of men strolled in, not locals. Elara barely spared them a glance until she felt it. A slow, crawling sensation along the back of her neck. Like being watched. Her spine stiffened. She turned her head slightly, catching the golden glow of a pair of eyes across the diner. A man broad-shouldered, impossibly tall, dressed in a black leather jacket and dark jeans, sat in the booth closest to the window. He was staring at her, his gaze heavy, like he was looking for something. Looking at her like he knew something. A prickle of unease crawled down her spine. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Something inside her, something buried deep, stirred. The lunch rush was a goddamn nightmare. Elara maneuvered through the cramped diner, weaving between tables as grease popped on the griddle behind the counter, the scent of cheap coffee and overcooked eggs thick in the air. Marty's was the kind of place where bad decisions were made over even worse food, and the usual crowd of truckers, drunks, and hungover college kids filled every seat. And then there were these guys. 3 men. Loud. Entitled. Pricks. They'd strolled in an hour ago, the stench of stale beer clinging to them like cheap cologne. The ringleader, greasy hair, cocky smirk, faded leather jacket, had been eyeing her since he sat down. His buddies weren't much better, shoving fries into their mouths like they'd never seen food before. Elara ignored them. Or at least she tried to. "Hey, sweetheart." Leather Jacket flashed her a grimy smile as she refilled his coffee. "What time you get off?" Elara didn't even blink. At the moment, too damn late. His buddies snickered. "Come on now," he drawled, reaching out and trailing his fingers along her wrist. That was a mistake. The air shifted. Elara stilled, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. Slowly she set the coffee pot down, and then she grabbed his wrist, not gently. Leather Jacket let out a choked gasp as Elara squeezed, her nails digging into his skin, her grip stronger than it had any right to be. She leaned down, her voice quiet, sharp, deadly. "Touch me again," she said, tightening her hold, "and I'll break your hand in 3 places. "Want to know which ones?" The color drained from his face. His buddies had stopped laughing. Elara released him with a shove, grabbing the coffee pot again and topping off his cup with a sweet, practiced smile. "Enjoy your coffee, gentlemen." She turned on her heel and walked away. Mia, standing by the counter, gaped at her. That was hot as hell. Marty, however, looked pissed. "Elara," he snapped, rubbing a hand over his face. "God damn it. You can't go around threatening customers." She crossed her arms. "Oh, so it's fine if they grope your staff. Look, I don't have time for this. I need paying customers, not a goddamn lawsuit. You're done. Get your shit and go." Elara blinked. "You're firing me, yeah," he huffed. "I'll give you 2 days' pay. Be grateful." Grateful? A slow, bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat. She untied her apron, threw it on the counter, and grabbed her bag. "You know what, Marty? Go fuck yourself." And with that she stormed out. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Elara shoved her hands into her jacket pockets as she walked, still seething from Marty's bullshit. Fired. Fired for defending herself, because some greasy asshole had wandered in with grabby hands and a beer gut. What kind of screwed-up world was this? Mia had offered to drive her home. Elara had refused. She needed the walk. Needed the space to breathe, to think, to figure out how the hell she was going to pay her rent next week. A cold gust of wind whipped past, sending a shiver down her spine. That's when she felt it. The sensation crept up her neck, slow and deliberate. Being watched. Elara's steps faltered. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, twisting shadows across the cracked pavement. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty road and the dull glow of a convenience store sign 2 blocks away. But the feeling didn't leave. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She picked up her pace. 1 block. 2. Almost there. A whisper of movement in the alley to her left. She turned her head just enough to catch it. A pair of golden eyes. Watching. Waiting. Not human. Her breath hitched. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished into the darkness. The streets were too quiet. Elara's boots thudded against the pavement, the echoes stretching unnaturally in the empty night. The distant hum of traffic from the main road didn't reach this part of town. It was just her, the cold air, and the weight of something unseen pressing against her spine. The golden eyes, she had seen them, felt them, and now her gut screamed at her that she wasn't alone. Tucking her chin down, she moved faster, her pulse hammering in her throat. The shortcut through the alley probably a dumbest choice, but she'd taken this route home 1,000,000 times. She wasn't scared. At least she kept telling herself that. A gust of wind slithered down the alley, carrying a strange woodsy scent, deep and rich, spiced with something darker. Something male. Then the world lurched. From nowhere a massive shape landed in front of her, the impact shaking the ground. Elara skidded to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. A wolf. A goddamn wolf the size of a truck, black as the void, with silver eyes glowing like moonlight on water. Her mind snapped into static. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. The wolf stalked toward her, its muscles shifting beneath its thick coat, its lethal grace making it terrifyingly beautiful. It didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It didn't need to. Power clung to it like an invisible cloak. Predatory, ancient, unstoppable. The alley was too narrow. No escape. Elara's lungs locked. Move, damn it. But her legs refused to work. The wolf took another step, and a low, rumbling sound vibrated through its chest, not a snarl, not a threat. Something almost possessive, Silver eyes locked onto hers, not an animal's eyes. A man's. Intelligent. Intentional. Claiming. Then the wolf lunged. Elara's scream barely left her lips before she was yanked backward, a blur of motion too fast to follow. She tumbled, but strong arms locked around her waist, steadying her against a rock-hard chest. The scent of smoke and cedar filled her lungs. A voice, low and lethal, purred near her ear. "You move too fast, Cade." Elara twisted, fighting against the iron grip, but the man holding her didn't budge. Not a man. A wolf. She knew before she even looked, before she saw the ruthless smirk, the wild crimson eyes, the tousled silver-white hair that caught the moonlight in strands like silk. A second wolf. But this one was human, and smug as hell. "Let me go," she snapped, slamming her elbow into his ribs. Lucian didn't even flinch. "You hear that, Cade? She thinks she's in charge." The massive black wolf Cade snarled, his fur bristling as he turned those silver eyes on the other man. A silent battle waged between them. Lucian grinned. Yeah, you saw her first." "Get over it." Elara's pulse thundered. They knew each other. They were working together. Shit. Lucian finally released her, stepping back just enough to keep her trapped between him and Cade. His gaze raked over her, assessing, curious. "You're smaller than I expected," he mused. "You're more of an asshole than I expected," she shot back. His grin sharpened. "We're going to get along just fine." A low whistle echoed from the alley entrance. Elara snapped her head toward the sound, her stomach dropping. Two more men stood in the shadows. One, lounging against the brick wall, arms crossed, mischief sparking in his hazel-green eyes. His dark hair was a mess of waves, and the wicked smirk on his lips told her he enjoyed chaos a little too much. Riven. The other man, standing just behind him, wasn't smiling. His black hair was perfectly slicked back, his face carved from ice angular, cold, imperious. His storm-grey eyes pinned her in place with a look so detached, so calculated, it made her skin prickle. Darius. A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't a random attack. These men had been waiting for her. "Okay," she breathed, forcing steel into her voice. "I don't know what kind of weird-ass werewolf cult this is, but I'm going to give you 5 seconds to let me walk the hell out of here." Silence. Then Cade, still in wolf form, let out a low, guttural growl. Lucian chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's not going to happen." Elara's stomach clenched. Run. Her instincts screamed it, but she had nowhere to go. No way out. The night felt thick, charged, the air pulsing with an energy she couldn't name. Then Cade moved, and everything went dark. Elara's vision blurred. 1 second she was standing in a dark alley, trapped between 4 dangerously powerful men. The next they were arguing over her like she was some prize up for grabs. Her pulse pounded, her brain scrambling to keep up, but all she could focus on was the fury radiating off them in thick waves. "You don't get to claim her just because you scented her first, Cade," Lucian sneered, crossing his arms. "The Bond doesn't give a damn about who called dibs." Cade's silver eyes burned as he stalked forward, his massive frame a wall of tension. "I don't need permission to claim what's mine. Mine." The words slammed into her chest like a wrecking ball, snapping her out of the shock. "Okay, no," Elara cut in, voice sharp, unyielding. "I'm not yours. I'm not anyone's. Whatever twisted wolf mating fantasy you've got going on, not interested." Riven let out a low whistle, grinning. Fiery. "I like her." Darius, the only one who hadn't spoken yet, sighed, rubbing his temple like she was an inconvenient problem he had to solve. His grey eyes pinned her down with a quiet, calculating intensity. "You're wasting your breath," he said flatly. "She's not going to understand any of this yet." "Understand what?" Elara's stomach knotted. She could handle creeps. She could handle assholes. But this was something else entirely. Something primal, ancient, dangerous. "I don't need to understand," she said, taking a slow step back, "because I don't care. You 4 can play your little power game somewhere else, but I am leaving, right now." Lucian sighed like she was exhausting him. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that." "Too much," Darius muttered. Elara's temper snapped. "Too much," she echoed, shoving a finger in his direction. "I was minding my own damn business before the werewolf boy band from hell decided to kidnap me. You don't get to act like I'm the problem here, Cade growled. Actually growled, his body vibrating with it. You think this is a joke? I think you're all insane, she shot back. Lucian snickered, but the amusement in his crimson eyes was edged with something darker. Cade stepped closer, his presence a storm rolling in, thick and suffocating. You can deny it all you want, he said, voice low, rough like gravel. But you're ours. And whether you accept it or not, we're not letting you go. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't a game. They were serious. Deadly serious. Something deep inside her twisted, a foreign heat curling in her gut. Something too wild to be fear, too sharp to be attraction. No, 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 no. She spun to run. And then sharp pain, a sting at the base of her neck. Her hand flew up, her fingers brushing over the tiny metal prick. Elara's vision wavered. Her limbs went slack, her breath stuttering, her body losing its fight against gravity. Shit. The last thing she saw before the world tilted sideways was Riven's smirk fading and Lucian's crimson eyes flashing with something almost regretful. The last thing she felt was warm hands catching her before she hit the ground. And then darkness. Pain. A dull, aching throb pulsed behind Elara's eyes, dragging her out of the dark. Her body felt heavy, her limbs slow to obey as she blinked against the soft glow of candlelight. What the hell? She shifted, only to realize she couldn't move her wrists. Elara's head snapped up. Thick leather straps pinned her wrists to the sides of an opulent, four-poster bed, her legs free but tangled in sheets softer than sin. Her pulse spiked. Where the hell was she? The room was massive, all dark wood and high-arched ceilings, lined with bookshelves filled with worn leather tomes. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing tall Gothic windows where moonlight spilled across an ornate fireplace carved with wolves and ancient runes. It was stunning, and it was wrong. She tugged at the restraints, rage sparking to life, shoving away the lingering fog in her brain. Voices drifted from the hallway. Low, masculine arguing. Elara's pulse thundered. Then the door swung open. Cade, the black wolf from the alley, now fully human, stepped inside like he owned the damn place. He was massive, broad-shouldered, with ink-black hair slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his fingers through it in frustration. His silver eyes locked onto hers, their intensity a physical thing, sharp and cutting. "You're awake." His voice was gravel and smoke, deep enough to ruffle across her skin. Elara narrowed her eyes. "Yeah, no thanks to you, asshole." Cade exhaled like he was already exhausted with her attitude. "You were panicking. The sedative was necessary." "Oh, that did it." Her temper snapped, white-hot. "Necessary," she hissed, yanking against the restraints. "You drugged me, kidnapped me, and now I'm tied to a freaking bed. What the hell is wrong with you?" Something flickered in his gaze, something possessive. "You'd have run." "I wasn't about to let that happen." She bared her teeth. "You don't get to make that decision, wolf boy." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I'm not your enemy." Elara barked out a laugh. "Oh, my bad. I must have misread the whole abduction thing." His silver gaze darkened. But before he could respond, Lucian's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You're wasting time, Cade." Lucian strode inside, his crimson eyes flashing in the candlelight, exuding a dangerous mix of elegance and lethality. He moved with a kind of effortless predatory grace that sent something sharp curling in her stomach. He flicked his gaze to her wrists, then back to Cade. "Is this really necessary?" "She's a flight risk," Cade muttered. "She's not a wild animal." Lucian tilted his head, those eerie red eyes pinning her in place. "Though I do like the fight in you, darling." Her glare could have set him on fire. Lucian's lips curled, like he enjoyed her fury. "Elara," Cade started, voice firm. "We need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk," she snapped. "Now that I'm tied down." Lucian snickered. Cade shot him a warning look before pinning her with his own intense, unreadable stare. "You're not human," he said. Elara froze. Her stomach bottomed out, and for a split second, something like ice crawled down her spine. Then rage. "Bullshit," she said. Cade didn't blink. "You're the reincarnation of Lunara, the moon goddess." Elara stared at him. Then she laughed. A full-bodied, incredulous, slightly manic laugh. "Oh my God," she threw her head back. "You have got to be kidding me." Neither of them looked amused. "Elara," Cade said carefully, I know this is hard to process, oh do you? She cut in. You think this, she gestured wildly with her restrained wrists, is hard to process. Buddy, I haven't even started processing yet. Lucian smirked. I like her. Shut up, Cade muttered. Elara's pulse pounded in her ears. This was insane. They thought she was a damn goddess. That she was what? Some celestial wolf queen reincarnated in human skin? Her lungs locked. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. But somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Something old. Something restless. A whisper of power curling through her veins, unfamiliar and yet not. A memory of silver flames. No. No, no, no. Elara shoved it down, buried it beneath every ounce of stubbornness she had. I don't care what kind of delusion you're all living in, she said, but you've got the wrong girl. Lucian exchanged a glance with Cade. She's in denial. She's human, she snapped. I don't do magic. I don't turn into a wolf. And I sure as hell don't belong to any of you. Lucian sighed like she was exhausting him already. Cade's jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. But before either of them could argue, the door swung open again, and Riven walked in, all lazy confidence and amused hazel eyes. Am I late? He drawled. Elara groaned, slumping against the pillows. Fantastic. It was a goddamn werewolf convention. Elara sat stiffly in a leather armchair, her wrists finally free, though she wasn't stupid enough to think she wasn't still a prisoner. The room was a study of shadows and firelight, all dark oak bookshelves, and a massive fireplace flickering gold across the polished wood floors. The four men surrounded her, a pack of predators watching their prey, each exuding a different kind of threat. Cade brooding, furious, unreadable. Lucian wicked amusement barely concealing something darker. Riven lazy, mischievous, trouble wrapped in a smirk. And Darius cold, calculating, already a step ahead. He was the one who approached her now, a sterile blade glinting between his fingers. Elara's muscles tensed. Try to stab me, and I swear to God, I'll shove that thing somewhere unpleasant. Riven choked on a laugh from where he leaned against a bookshelf. She's got bite. Lucian smirked. She does. Let's see if she bleeds like a goddess. Darius didn't react. Didn't so much as blink. He just crouched beside her, his presence a wall of cold authority, and took her hand in his. Elara yanked back, but his grip was unyielding, firm without force. Relax, he said, his voice low, smooth. It's just a test. A test for what? She demanded, her pulse kicking up. Darius met her gaze, those steel-grey eyes like storm clouds before a hurricane. For the truth. Then, before she could react, the blade sliced across the tip of her finger. Elara hissed, instinctively curling her hand away. Son of a, she stopped, because her blood wasn't red. It was silver. A thin, gleaming line of liquid moonlight beaded at the cut, catching the firelight, shimmering like something not entirely of this world. Her breath hitched. Lucian let out a low whistle. Riven's smirk disappeared. Cade didn't look surprised, just resigned. Darius wiped the blade clean with a cloth, his face impassive. Well, he said, that settles that. Elara's stomach bottomed out. This was a trick. A trick or a hallucination or no? No, she wasn't buying this. This doesn't mean anything, she forced out, clenching her fist, hiding the cut as if that would erase it. Lucian arched a brow. Oh, because human blood doesn't usually glow. Neither does yours, she snapped. So what, you guys gonna tell me you're moon gods too? Riven grinned. Not yet. But the night is young. Cade made a sound that was almost a growl. Enough. Elara's head was spinning, her body betraying her, her own goddamn blood mocking her. Silver. She wasn't human. She wasn't human. The words thundered inside her skull, panic pressing against her ribs, but she shoved it down. No, no, she refused to let this be true. It was wrong. It was a mistake. It had to be. Elara was done. Done with the cryptic bullshit. Done with the towering smug werewolves watching her like she was some shiny new possession. Done with the games, the power plays, the whole twisted fantasy they were trying to force her into. She stood fast, shoving out of the chair so quickly it scraped against the hardwood. Lucian, the closest, tensed slightly, but she ignored him, turning on Cade instead. You need to let me go. He didn't move. Did you hear me? She demanded, shoving a hand against his chest. It was like trying to move a damn wall. Cade's silver eyes darkened. You're not leaving. Her teeth clenched. You think just because my blood's got a weird little glow, I'm suddenly one of you." She scoffed, glaring up at him. "News flash, Alpha, I'm still human. I don't feel the bond, I don't feel anything." Liar. A flicker of something hot and unfamiliar licked through her chest, but she crushed it. She would not give them that power. Lucien sighed, shaking his head. "Daniil's a bitch." Elara whirled on him. "And so are you." Riven laughed, eyes dancing with amusement. "Damn, she really doesn't give a shit, huh?" Elara jabbed a finger in his direction. "Don't even start." Riven grinned, stepping closer, the heat of his body brushing against hers. "Come on, sweetheart. You're really gonna tell me you don't feel anything? Not even a little?" He leaned in, voice dropping to a sinful murmur, curious. Her stomach clenched, because damn him, he was too close, too warm, too much, and her body was betraying her. A slow smirk pulled at his lips, like he could sense it. Elara shoved him away. "Hard, I'd rather die," Lucien sighed. "See, that's the problem with fighting fate." She glared at him. "Oh yeah. And what exactly happens if I keep fighting it?" His expression turned cold, something dark flickering in those crimson eyes. "The bond gets angry," he said simply. "And when the bond is angry, it burns." Something inside her shivered, her instincts flashing danger, danger, danger. Lucien tilted his head. "You think you feel nothing now? Give it time, darling. The bond will punish you for resisting. It always does." She hated the certainty in his voice, hated that the others weren't arguing with him. She hated that, deep down. Some part of her believed him. But she wasn't giving in. She wasn't theirs. And she'd rather burn than be caged. Her pulse spiked. Her breath came fast. And then Elara bolted. Darius cursed, Cade lunged. But she was already moving, darting past them, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors as she tore through the hallway. They were fast, but adrenaline made her faster. She hit the grand staircase, her heart slamming against her ribs, the front doors in sight, then a hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her back. Her spine collided with a solid chest, an arm locking around her waist, a deep growl vibrating through her skin. Elara, Cade's voice was low, dark, a warning. Her breath shattered. Her body was pinned against his heat branding her, consuming her, every part of him a threat she didn't know how to fight. And worse, she didn't hate it. His lips brushed her ear. "You're not going anywhere." Her pulse stuttered. And then Cade threw her over his shoulder and carried her back inside. Act 2. The past comes calling. Elara ran like the devil himself was on her heels, because he was, sort of, the trees blurred past, the cold night air slashing across her skin, but it wasn't the chill that sent a tremor through her bones, it was him. She could feel him. Even without turning around, she knew he was there. Cade, stalking. Hunting. Getting closer. Her breath came fast, her muscles burning, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. If she slowed down, if she hesitated for even a second, a deep, low growl rumbled behind her. Her stomach clenched. Shit. Her pulse thundered as she dodged fallen branches, her bare feet barely making a sound against the damp earth. The forest was thick, the moonlight barely slicing through the canopy above, but she didn't need to see, she knew these woods. At least she thought she did, until the bond started pulling her back. It was an invisible thread, tightening, coiling around her ribs, whispering against her skin in a way that made her feel him everywhere. Her steps faltered for a fraction of a second. It was all he needed. A heavy rush of air, a blur of motion, and suddenly she was on the ground, flipped onto her back, pinned beneath a solid, unyielding weight. Heat, strength. The overwhelming scent of smoke and cedar. Cade, his silver eyes burned down at her, fierce and furious. Elara's chest heaved, her fingers curling into the damp soil beneath her, her body stupidly aware of how perfectly his weight fit against hers, hot, powerful, inescapable. "I told you," he growled, voice rough as sin, "you're not leaving." She buckled beneath him, trying to shove at his shoulders, but the effort was pathetic. Cade didn't move, didn't even flinch. Elara bared her teeth. "You're insufferable." His lips curved slightly, something dark and possessive lurking in the smirk. "And you're reckless." "Let me go." "Not happening." A pulse of heat flickered between them, the mate bond surging like a living thing, thickening the air, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to ignore the pull clawing at her insides. She hated it. Hated how her body reacted to his presence, how the warmth of his skin sent tingles up her spine, how her traitorous pulse skipped when his grip on her wrists tightened, just slightly, just enough to send a thrill curling through her stomach. Cade inhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. He felt it too. That realization only pissed her off more. She glared up at him, chest rising and falling too fast, nails biting into her palms. "You can't keep me here." His silver gaze darkened, flashing with something dangerous. "Elara," he murmured, low, rough, a warning. Her skin prickled. "You're mine," he said simply, like it was fact, like it was law, like she wasn't allowed to deny it. She did. Vehemently. "I don't belong to anyone," she snarled. The second the words left her lips, the bond snapped. Not broke. Snapped. A wave of searing heat crashed through her veins, like lightning striking inside her chest, fierce and unforgiving, as if the bond itself was punishing her for rejecting it. Elara gasped, her spine arching, her hands grabbing at him. Without thinking, Cade growled, low and dangerous, his grip tightening, pinning her down completely. "Stop fighting it," he said, his voice hoarse, edged with strain, like the bond was pulling him apart too. She shook her head, teeth clenched, body trembling. But she couldn't move, not because he held her there, but because the bond wouldn't let her. It was too much, too hot, too strong, too undeniable. His scent wrapped around her, his presence pressing against her skin like a brand, his breath warm and uneven against her jaw. "Elara," he rasped, his silver gaze dropping to her lips. She should have been scared. She wasn't. She should have been furious. She was. But underneath that fury, beneath that raging storm, there was something else. Something slow burning. Something dangerous. Something she didn't want to name. The bond coiled tighter, demanding. Her chest shuddered, her pulse pounding. His lips were so close. Too close. For a second, just a second, she almost let go. Almost. Then reality crashed back in. Elara wrenched her gaze from his, forcing her walls back up, locking down the pull, shoving away whatever the hell that just was. "You can't make me stay," she whispered, her voice thick with something raw. Cade went still. Something flickered in his expression, something dangerous. Then he exhaled, his grip loosening. He pushed himself off her, rising to his feet, but he didn't offer a hand, didn't help her up, didn't say a damn thing. Elara's body felt wrecked, her limbs shaky as she slowly stood. Cade watched her, silent, cold, unreadable. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the darkness, shaken, furious, and more confused than ever. Because even though she'd won this round, even though she'd gotten exactly what she wanted, she still felt like she was losing. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the silence of the forest pressing in around them like a living thing. Elara's lungs burned, her heart a wild, erratic drum against her ribs as she ran, the distant glow of moonlight slicing through the canopy above. But she wasn't fast enough. She felt him before she heard him. A shift in the wind, the hair on her arms standing on end, the weight of an unseen predator closing in. Then a blur of movement. A solid wall of muscle and heat crashed into her from the side, stealing her breath, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangled mess of limbs. Elara gasped as her back hit the dirt, Cade's weight taging her beneath him, his silver eyes glowing like molten steel in the dark. He didn't say a word. Didn't have to. The air crackled between them, heavy and charged, the mate bond coiling tight, pulling at her in ways she refused to acknowledge. "Get off me," she snapped, shoving at his rock-solid chest. Cade didn't move, didn't even flinch. Instead, his large hands slid to her wrists, pinning them above her head, his grip firm but not painful. "Keep running," he murmured, his voice a low growl, "and I'll keep catching you." Elara's pulse spiked, fury curling in her stomach. "I am not yours." A dark, almost amused sound rumbled from his chest. "No." His silver gaze flicked over her face, slow, searching, like he was memorizing every little thing she hated about him in that moment. "Then why does your heart race when I'm close?" Her teeth clenched. "Because I hate you." Another smirk, dark and infuriatingly confident. "No, you don't," Elara hissed, thrashing beneath him. But it only made things worse. Because suddenly she was aware of everything. The hard press of his thighs against hers, the heat of his body blanketing her, the roughness of his fingers against her skin. Her breath came faster, uneven, betraying her. Cade's grip tightened, his voice dropping lower. "Stop fighting it, Elara," she stiffened. The words were a demand, a plea, a warning. And something inside her, something she'd buried deep, deep down, wanted to listen. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She shoved at him again, this time managing to twist her body just enough to slip free, rolling out from beneath him and staggering to her feet. Cade was up just as fast, his gaze locking onto hers, a predator toying with his prey. She took a shaky step back, her fists clenched. "I'll never accept this." A beat of silence. Then Cade inhaled, exhaled slowly, like he was trying to reel himself in, trying to control something raw, something on the edge of snapping. And then he stepped back. Just a fraction, but it sent her pulse hammering for an entirely different reason. "I won't force you," he said, his voice rough, controlled. Elara blinked, thrown off balance by the unexpected words. "But let me be clear," he continued, his silver eyes burning into hers. "I'm done chasing you. You don't want the bond. Fine, you think you can survive out here alone. Prove it." Her breath hitched. He was daring her to walk away, to leave, to go out there and survive without him. "You're not serious." Cade's lips curled, but there was no humor in his expression. "Try me." Elara swallowed hard. She should be grateful. Should be thrilled that he wasn't going to drag her back. But something about the way he stood there, cold and unreadable, like he had already made his peace with her rejection, it rattled her. Because for the first time she wondered, what if she was wrong? What if fate wasn't? What if walking away from him, from all of them, wasn't just freedom? What if it was a mistake? Cade tilted his head slightly, like he could hear every single thought racing through her skull. And then he said the words that sealed her fate. "Go on, Elara." His voice was quiet, almost mocking. "Let's see how long you last." And then he turned and walked away. The town was quiet. Too quiet. Elara staggered down the empty street, barefoot, exhausted, aching, but she'd made it. Somehow. The last hour had been a blur of trees and moonlight, of running and stumbling and ignoring the way the mate bond clawed at her insides, demanding she turn back. But she hadn't. She'd fought through it, had pushed forward, had ignored the way her body had screamed for Cade's heat, for the safety of his presence, for the damn scent of smoke and cedar that wouldn't leave her mind. She'd made it. And yet the moment she stepped onto asphalt, a wave of dizziness slammed into her, her vision swimming, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a desperate creature trying to escape. No, not now. Not the ground tilted, her knees buckling. The moment her palms hit the pavement, the world vanished. Flames, screams, blood. Elara stood in the middle of a battlefield, wind ripping through her hair, her bare feet sinking into the ashen ground. Bodies littered the field. Massive wolves, some still in the throes of their final breaths, their golden eyes dimming into nothing. She knew this place. Had seen it before. Had felt it before. A battle she didn't remember living, but somehow couldn't forget. The air was thick with the scent of burning fur and death, the sky above twisting and churning with an unnatural storm, silver lightning slashing across the darkness. At the heart of it all, a woman stood before her, hair like spun silver, eyes glowing a brilliant, terrifying white blue, flames licking at her fingertips, power swirling in a chaotic storm around her. Lunara. Not a goddess, not a legend. Her, Elara tried to move, but she was trapped, her body frozen, her lungs tight with something raw and unbearable. The silver-haired woman, the version of her that wasn't her, lifted a hand slick with blood, her gaze cold, unyielding. "And then you brought this upon yourself." Elara screamed. Elara. The voice dragged her back. Rough. Familiar. Too familiar. Her eyes snapped open, her breath staggered, and suddenly she wasn't in the battlefield, wasn't in the past. She was back on the cold pavement of a town she didn't recognize, the neon glow of a nearby gas station flickering in her blurry vision. And standing over her, his silver eyes flashing with something dark, was Cade. His hands were on her, one cradling her face, the other wrapped around her wrist, like he'd been trying to wake her up for a while. Elara's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, her entire body shaking. She didn't fight him. Didn't move. Couldn't. Not when the vision was still seared into her mind, Not when her chest still ached with something old and unexplainable. His jaw tightened, his voice dropping to something low, something dangerous. What the hell just happened? Elara swallowed hard. She had no answer. She only knew one thing for certain. She was never supposed to run. And now she wasn't sure she'd survive what came next. Heat. It pressed in from all sides, curling around Elara's limbs, dragging her down into something thick, heavy, unrelenting. Her body shook, her skin slick with sweat, her mind a murky mess of shadows and voices she didn't recognize. Her breaths were shallow, every inhale a struggle, her pulse weak and frantic. She was burning. From the inside out. Then cool hands, firm, strong, steady. A deep voice, low and rich, cut through the haze. "You're hotter than hell, darling," someone murmured, the words edged with something close to concern. Lucian. She barely registered the way he gathered her up, his arms slipping beneath her knees, her back pressing against the unforgiving heat of his body. She should have fought, should have pulled away, should have done something, but she couldn't. Could barely move. Could barely think through the aching pull of the bond, tightening, twisting, keeping her from slipping too far into the dark. "You're not dying on me, Elara," Lucian muttered, voice gruff. "I refuse to let you." Then the world spun, and she sank into the darkness once more. Elara stood on a battlefield, but this time she wasn't just watching. She was there. The wind howled around her, thick with the scent of blood and fire, but her body didn't ache, her lungs didn't burn, she felt nothing at all. Nothing but the sheer weight of power rippling through her veins, fierce and unstoppable. Her silver hair whipped around her face, her bare feet pressing into the charred, broken ground, and before her 4 figures. Tall, shadowed, unclear. They stood at her back, surrounding her like silent sentinels, their presence an unshakable truth buried deep in her bones. One of them stepped forward. A whisper of movement, a deep, gravelly voice at her ear. "Lunara, we will fight with you," the vision shattered. Pain lashed through her skull, and suddenly she was falling backward, away from the battlefield, away from the figures, away from the only answers she had ever gotten, and then blackness. Elara gasped awake, her entire body on fire. She jolted upright, every nerve sparking, a pounding, a pulse erratic. A strong hand landed on her bare thigh, steadying her. "Easy, sweetheart." "Lucian." She blinked, vision swimming, the cool air of the room prickling against her overheated skin. She was back in the mansion. His room. The scent of leather, cedar, and something darker surrounded her, clinging to the sheets beneath her hands, mixing with the deep, earthy scent that was uniquely him. Lucian sat at the edge of the bed, shirtless, his muscles taut, his crimson eyes sharp, searching, assessing her. Elara swallowed hard, her throat raw, her body still trembling from whatever the hell that vision was. "Drink," he said, handing her a glass of cold water. She hesitated. Lucian lifted a brow. "I didn't poison it, if that's what you're thinking." With zero trust, but too thirsty to argue, she took the glass and downed half of it in one go, the cool liquid soothing the burn in her throat. She set it down on the nightstand, glancing at him, aware that he hadn't moved. "How long was I out?" she asked. Lucian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, his sharp features partially shadowed by the flickering candlelight. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." His eyes darkened. "Neither is yours." Her breath hitched. Because he knew. He knew she had seen something. Felt it. Understood it. "Tell me," he murmured, voice softer now, edged with something dangerous. "What did you see?" Elara clenched her jaw. "Nothing." Lucian tilted his head, studying her. Then, too fast for her to react, he was closer, his hand skimming the side of her neck, his touch too warm, too steady, a stark contrast to the chill rolling through her bones. The mate bond flared, electric and demanding, but neither of them moved away. "Don't lie to me, darling," he said, voice silk over steel. "I can feel it." Something woke up inside you. Her chest tightened. She should have pushed him away. Should have fought. But she didn't, because he was right. Something inside her had stirred, something deep and old, something that whispered of war and fire, of power and loss, of wolves standing at her back and calling her by a name she didn't recognize but somehow already owned. Lunara. Her hands fisted the sheets, her breaths uneven. Lucian's fingers curled around her throat, his thumb brushing over her pulse, a touch that was nowhere near rough, but still unraveled her piece by piece. He leaned in, his lips almost brushing her ear. "You can't keep running from this." Elara swallowed hard. Lucian pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "There's something hunting you." A cold chill crept up her spine. She shook her head. "You mean Cade?" Lucian huffed a dark laugh, his thumb still lazily circling her hammering pulse. "Cade wants to claim you." "That's different." His expression turned serious, deadly. "But something else. It wants to kill you." A slow, creeping dread curled in her stomach. Lucian sat back, running a hand through his silver hair, his eyes grim. "We don't know what it is yet, but it's waiting, Elara. And it's getting closer." Her pulse stuttered, because she knew deep down she already knew. Whatever was coming for her, it had always been waiting. The Blackwood mansion loomed in front of her, all dark stone and Gothic grandeur, the kind of place that felt more like a fortress than a home. Elara stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, jaw tight, mind racing. She didn't want to be here. Didn't want to breathe the same air as the arrogant, possessive wolves who thought they had some celestial claim over her. But her body was still weak from the fever, her mind wrecked from visions she couldn't explain. And if she were honest with herself, she had nowhere else to go. "Smart choice," Cade said, his deep voice vibrating through her like a slow-moving storm. She scowled at him. "It's not a choice." His silver eyes narrowed slightly, flashing with challenge. "You walked back here, didn't you?" "More like dragged back," she muttered, brushing past him. Lucian chuckled from where he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his broad chest. "I'd say welcome home, but I have a feeling you'd throat punch me." She shot him a sweet, venomous smile. "You learn fast." Cade sighed, rubbing a hand down his face like she was already giving him a headache. "Look, no one's forcing you to be here," Elara snorted. "You literally kidnapped me. You literally ran into the woods with no plan and almost died." Her fingers curled into fists, nails biting into her palms. "I would have been fine." Lucian arched a brow. "Would you?" Her stomach tightened because no, she wouldn't have. The memory of the visions, the sickness, the raw pull of something ancient inside her still clawed at her ribs, still unnerved the hell out of her. She hated it. Hated how much she didn't understand. Hated even more that these wolves seemed to know more about her than she did. So Riven drawled, strolling up behind her with that lazy, knowing smirk, "You're officially our guest. How long do you think you'll last before you stop pretending you don't belong here?" Her head snapped toward him. "Oh, I don't belong here." He grinned, his hazel eyes flickering with heat, with amusement. "That's cute." Her teeth clenched. Darius, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, finally spoke, his voice cool and controlled. "You can deny the bond all you want," he said, his grey eyes sharp as ice, "but it won't make it disappear." Elara stiffened. Or because she had spent every second trying to ignore it. The mate bond was a constant hum in her veins, a weight pressing against her skin, making her painfully aware of every one of them. Cade, with his relentless dominance and barely leashed temper. Lucian, with his twisted games and unreadable crimson gaze. Riven, with his reckless charm and maddening smirks. Darius, with his cold calculation and the kind of silence that was always dangerous. And it was getting worse. Every second she was near them, every second she breathed them in, her body betrayed her a little more. Like she was being rewired. Like she was becoming something else. She hated it. She feared it. And she'd be damned if she accepted it. She squared her shoulders. "I'll stay, but only temporarily." Cade's jaw ticked. "Define temporarily." She lifted her chin. "Until I figure out what the hell is happening to me." Lucian smirked. "What's happening to you is fate, darling." Her glare could have set him on fire. Cade exhaled through his nose, looking like he was restraining the urge to shake some sense into her. Fine. Temporary. Something about the way he said it told her he didn't believe that for a second. She lifted a brow. "And in return?" Cade's expression hardened. "You train. You learn how to fight." Her stomach dropped. Train? Fight. Oh, she knew what that meant. He wanted her to become like them. She shook her head. "No, absolutely not." "It's not up for debate," he said, stepping closer, his presence too big, too much, filling every part of her senses. "You don't want the bond. Fine. But that thing hunting you, it doesn't care what you want." Elara swallowed hard, hating that he had a point. Lucien shrugged. I mean, you could keep pretending you don't need us, but where has that gotten you so far? Riven grinned. Unconscious. More than once. She shot him a glare, her pulse pounding against her ribs. She needed control. And maybe, just maybe, learning how to fight would give her that. It would let her get out of this mess before it was too late. Would let her walk away fully, finally, without looking back. Because that's what she wanted. Right? Elara sucked in a breath, forcing her voice to be steady. Fine, I'll train. Cade's silver gaze flickered with something she couldn't name. Lucien smirked. That's the spirit. Darius nodded once, as if he had already expected this outcome. Riven just looked far too entertained. Just don't fall for us in the process, sweetheart, he murmured. Her hands itched to punch him. Instead, she leveled them all with a glare. This doesn't mean I trust you. Cade's expression darkened. Then I guess we'll just have to change that. The training grounds were nothing more than a clearing in the woods. The ground packed hard from years of use, the air thick with the scent of pine earth, and something inherently wild. Elara stood in the center of it, her hands curled into fists, sweat already slicking her skin from the warmth of the late afternoon sun. And across from her, smirking like he had all the time in the world, was Riven. He was barefoot, shirtless, his toned torso covered in tattoos that curled over his muscles like ink-dipped shadows. His hazel eyes flickered with wicked amusement, like he knew a secret she hadn't figured out yet. You ready, sweetheart? He drawled, rolling his shoulders, the easy arrogance in his voice grating her nerves raw. Elara exhaled slowly. She hated him. Or at least she wanted to. He was a cocky, irritating, reckless rogue of an alpha, and yet he made her feel alive in ways she didn't want to examine. Not when he was grinning at her like that, all playfully predatory. She narrowed her eyes. You planning on standing there all day, or are we actually going to fight? His smirk deepened. Oh, I'm enjoying the view. Her jaw clenched. I hate you. No, you don't. God, she wanted to punch him. Which was exactly what he wanted. Her fingers curled tighter, her stance shifting as she squared up. She had no formal training, no experience, but she was stubborn as hell. And if Riven thought she was just going to roll over and accept this, he had another thing coming. All right, Riven sighed, moving into a casual fighting stance, like he wasn't even taking this seriously. The way I see it, you've got two choices, sweetheart. Fight, his eyes gleamed, or submit. Her spine stiffened, and he knew it. Knew exactly what buttons to push. His smirk turned downright filthy. Careful, Elara. I've been told I'm very persuasive when it comes to submission. Heat flashed through her, sharp and annoyingly visceral. Before she could think better of it, she swung at him. Fast, hard, angry. He dodged easily, his reflexes too damn quick, and she barely had time to react before he was behind her, his body dangerously close, his breath warm against the side of her neck. Sloppy, he murmured, low and intimate, his fingers brushing against her bare forearm, sending a shiver through her skin. She twisted, aiming her elbow at his ribs, but he danced back, laughing like this was just a game to him. Infuriating. Absolutely infuriating. She took another swing, faster this time, and he sidestepped it again, but just barely. Come on, sweetheart, he taunted, circling her like she was prey. That the best you got. Something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she faked right then spun left, using the momentum to drive her fist into his stomach. Solid contact. Riven let out a surprised grunt, his abs tensing beneath her knuckles. For a second, a pure, stunned silence settled between them. Then he laughed. A real, genuine low chuckle, one that rumbled in his chest like a slow-moving storm. Well, well, he murmured, rubbing the spot where she'd hit him. Looks like you've got some fight in you after all. Elara gasped for breath, her knuckles throbbing, her chest heaving from the effort. Riven tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her like he was seeing her differently now. Not just as a challenge. Not just as something to tease and provoke, but as a real threat. A slow grin stretched across his face, all sharp teeth and male satisfaction. You know, he mused, stepping closer, his bare chest brushing hers, the heat of him caging her in. I think I like you even more now. She refused to react, even as her pulse betrayed her, hammering against her ribs. Hit me again, he murmured. Let's see if it was just a lucky shot. Elara lifted her chin, breathing hard, heat curling low in her stomach, her fingers twitching with the urge to punch that stupid smirk off his face again. She didn't submit. And she never would. And from the way Riven looked at her now, hungry, amused, intrigued, he knew it too. Elara's muscles still burned from training, her knuckles aching from where they had connected with Riven's annoyingly smug abs. But she wasn't about to let that show, especially not in front of the cold, unreadable wolf currently leading her down the mansion's endless hallways. Darius walked like he owned the world, or at least like he could burn it down if necessary. His every movement was controlled, deliberate, his power a silent thing that didn't need to be shouted. Unlike the others who taunted, smirked, and made their dominance known in ways that set her teeth on edge, Darius's was quieter, sharper, and maybe that was worse. Elara folded her arms as they stepped into what could only be described as a war room, a long wooden table at the center, maps spread across it, walls lined with shelves full of old books, some so ancient the spines had cracked. A large black wolf crest was carved into the wall behind the table, the Blackwood Pack insignia. But there were others, symbols, sigils, crests that didn't belong to just one pack. Her stomach tightened. Darius gestured toward a chair, his steel-gray eyes assessing her. "Sit." She lifted a brow. "You sure you want me near the furniture? I might set something on fire." His lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. "You overestimate your abilities," he said smoothly. "If you were going to destroy something, you would have already." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. Elara sank into the chair, trying to ignore the way he watched her, calculating, waiting. Like he already knew exactly how this conversation was going to end. Darius took the seat across from her, fingers steepled, his posture flawless, his presence like a blade, controlled but dangerous. "You wanted to know why you can't leave," he said. Elara leaned back. "Oh, let me guess, more fate bullshit?" Darius didn't blink. "No, politics." Her lips parted slightly, thrown by the matter-of-fact response. He gestured to the table. "There are 5 major packs in the region, all with fragile alliances. For the last century, peace has been maintained because no one pack has had enough power to dominate the others." "And now?" she asked warily. "Now," he said, holding her gaze, "you exist." A chill crawled down her spine. Elara shook her head, forcing a laugh. "That's ridiculous." Darius leaned forward slightly. Not looming, not threatening, but still making her feel like the air had thickened. "Is it?" he asked. "You are the reincarnation of Lunara, the moon goddess. Whether you believe it or not, every single wolf outside these walls is waiting to see what you do next." She swallowed hard. "And," his gray eyes darkened. "And if you side with one pack over the others, it could tip the balance of power permanently." She stiffened. Darius's voice remained steady, unwavering. "Some will want to claim you. Some will want to kill you before that can happen. And some will want to use you to burn everything down." Elara's stomach turned, her fingers curling against her thighs. "That's not my problem," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Darius studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, brutally, he said, "It is now." The weight of his words settled deep, pressing against her ribs like a vice. She had been fighting them from the moment she got here, trying to run, trying to deny what they were saying. But this wasn't about mates or bonds or fate. This was power. And power had consequences. A sharp knock on the door made them both turn. Lucien leaned against the frame, his crimson gaze flicking between them, amusement dancing at the edges. "Are you scaring her, Darius?" Darius didn't even look away from her. "I'm telling her the truth." Lucien sighed, stepping inside, dropping into the chair beside her. "And how's she handling it?" Darius finally leaned back, assessing her again. Elara met his gaze head-on, swallowing down the storm brewing in her chest. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, voice stronger than she expected. "And I sure as hell am not picking sides." Lucien smirked. "We'll see." Darius didn't argue, and that terrified her more than anything, because it meant he already knew she wouldn't have a choice. The air between them crackled. Tense. Heavy. Too much. Elara stood in the dimly lit training room, breath ragged, muscles sore, her entire body vibrating from the fight she'd just had with Cade, a fight that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with control. Cade paced like a caged beast, his jaw tight, his silver eyes burning. The scent of smoke and pine clung to his skin, thick and utterly consuming, making her chest feel like it was caught in a vice. "You're reckless," he growled. She folded her arms, ignoring the way his voice scraped down her spine like a slow drag of claws. And you're an overbearing control freak, she shot back. Cade's gaze flicked to her mouth, then back to her eyes. You think this is a joke? I think you're suffocating me. His hands fisted at his sides, his entire body vibrating with restrained fury. Elara, he said, voice low, dangerous. You don't get it, do you? Her pulse hammered, her skin burning, but she refused to let him see it. Enlighten me, Alpha, she taunted, lifting her chin. Cade moved fast, too fast. 1 second there was distance between them. The next he had her pinned against the training room wall, his body a wall of heat and tension. Elara sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers curling into his shirt on instinct, her stomach twisting in ways she wasn't ready to admit. Cade braced his forearm against the wall beside her head, caging her in, his silver eyes liquid fire. You drive me insane, he murmured, voice rough raw. Her throat tightened. Something dark and heady and terrifyingly inevitable curled in her chest, something too big to name. She needed to shove him away, needed to stop this before it started. But instead she stayed right where she was. His scent, his heat, the way his breath brushed against her lips, it pulled her under, dragged her deep, made it impossible to think. Then his free hand brushed against her waist, just the barest touch, a whisper of contact. But it sent a shockwave straight through her, white-hot and electric. Elara's breath hitched, her entire body locking up. Cade's silver eyes darkened. He felt it too. He knew. The mate bond wasn't silent anymore. It was screaming. His hand tightened on her hip, just slightly, just enough to send another pulse of heat spiraling through her veins. He wasn't forcing her, wasn't trapping her. She could move, she could leave. But she didn't. Cade's gaze searched hers, his breathing rough, his control slipping, fraying, breaking. Elara, he murmured, voice hoarse. She didn't know if he was warning her or himself, didn't know who moved first, didn't care. Because suddenly his mouth was on hers and the world exploded, heat, raw, all-consuming. His lips were firm, demanding, claiming her in a way that sent a tremor straight through her bones. The mate bond surged, roaring to life, sending a wave of electricity snapping across her skin. Elara gasped, but Cade swallowed the sound, his grip tightening, his body pressing into hers, his heat making her dizzy. A deep, rough growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her as his tongue swept against hers, hot, intoxicating, utterly devastating. She should have fought it, should have shoved him away. But she didn't. Because for the first time she wasn't just running from them. She was running from herself, and for just a second she let go. For just a second she let herself drown in him. But only for a second, because the moment reality crashed back in, panic seized her chest, white-hot and blinding. She yanked back, her breath ragged, her fingers trembling. Cade's grip on her loosened instantly, his silver eyes stormy, unreadable. Elara, but she was already shoving past him, already running. Because if she stayed, if she looked at him any longer, she didn't know if she'd ever leave. Elara didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air biting against her overheated skin, her breath coming too fast, too shallow. Her hands shook, her lips still tingled. She pressed her fingers against them, her stomach coiling in ways she didn't understand. It was just a kiss, just a kiss. Then why did it feel like her entire world had tilted sideways? Why did it feel like she just stepped off the edge of a cliff with no parachute? The mate bond was alive now, louder, pressing against her, pulling her back toward him. She hated it. Hated that part of her wanted to go back. Hated that Cade's scent still lingered on her skin. Elara, she jerked, spinning to find Lucien leaning against the tree line watching her. His crimson gaze flicked to her mouth, then back to her eyes. He knew. Of course he knew. He pushed off the tree, strolling toward her, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. You kissed him. It wasn't a question. She crossed her arms, stomach tight. It was a mistake. Lucien hummed, tilting his head. Was it? Her jaw clenched. Yes. A beat of silence. Then he laughed, low, amused, infuriating. Elara scowled. What's so funny? Lucien stopped in front of her, his gaze dipping to her lips again, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice too soft, too dangerous, he said, You don't make mistakes, darling. You just don't want to admit what you already know. Her pulse skipped. Lucien smirked. Don't worry, you'll figure it out soon enough. Then he walked away, leaving her standing there, shaken, furious, and even more confused than before. Because deep down she was afraid he was right, and that scared her more than anything. The night was too quiet. Elara lay awake in the massive, unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still pounding from that damn kiss. She could still feel it. The press of Cade's lips, the raw, consuming heat of it. She hated how easily she'd fallen into him, how her body had betrayed her, how it had wanted. Even now, hours later, the make-bond hummed beneath her skin, taunting her, whispering to her. She shoved the covers back, needing air. The Blackwood mansion was eerily still, shadows stretching long in the hallways as she stepped barefoot onto the cold wooden floor. The flickering lanterns on the walls cast soft, golden glows, but something about the silence unnerved her. She exhaled slowly. She was being paranoid. Just because she'd learned she was some supposed divine power, that didn't mean someone was going to. A cold gust of wind swept through the hallway. Elara's spine stiffened. The doors were all closed. No windows were open. Then where the hell had that come from? A shiver skated down her spine, something ancient and primal in her blood roaring to attention. She wasn't alone. Elara whirled and a hand clamped over her mouth. She fought immediately, twisting, thrashing, but whoever had grabbed her was fast, strong, relentless. Sha! A voice hissed, breath hot against her ear. Low, raspy. Wrong. She bucked against him, her knee slamming into something solid, but it barely made him stumble. His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her against a solid chest, his scent not one of her alphazis, cloying and unfamiliar. You were never meant to return. The whispered words sent ice through her veins. Elara twisted, bit down on his hand, and the second his grip loosened, she threw her elbow back, catching him hard in the ribs. He cursed, but she didn't wait, she ran. Her feet slammed against the wooden floors, her breath ragged as she raced toward the end of the hall, her mind spinning. Who was he? How did he get in? And what the hell did he mean? She didn't get far. Fingers snagged the back of her shirt, yanking her backward, and suddenly she was falling, her stomach lurching, her heart slamming against her ribs, then a blur of motion. A snarl, and the attacker was gone. Riven stood in front of her now, shirtless, barefoot, his muscles tense, his eyes glowing with pure, violent rage. Elara sucked in a sharp breath. There was blood on his hands, and when she looked past him, her attacker lay motionless on the floor, his body crumpled, his throat torn open. Dead! Elara's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her limbs still locked with adrenaline, with shock, with the weight of what had just happened. Riven turned toward her, his hazel eyes still dark with the remnants of his wolf. You're bleeding, he murmured. She blinked at him. What? He reached out, his fingers brushing over the side of her neck. Elara flinched. Not from pain, but from the sensation. From the way his touch sent a slow, curling heat beneath her skin. His jaw tightened. His knife, he said, eyes locked onto the cut just beneath her jaw. He got close. She hadn't even felt it. She was still trying to breathe, still trying to process what just happened, still trying to shake the way her body had instinctively leaned toward his touch. Who was he? She whispered. Riven's expression darkened. Not one of ours. Elara swallowed hard, her chest tightening, her mind racing. You were never meant to return. That's what he said, she murmured, looking down at the lifeless body. Riven stiffened. Someone in the pack let him in, she realized, her breath catching. Someone wanted me dead. Riven's face hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. They're dead the second we find them, he said, his voice a low, furious growl. Something about the danger in his tone, the absolute certainty in it, made her shiver. Not in fear. In something else. Something she didn't want to name. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Cade's voice roared through the hall. What the hell happened? She turned to find all of them there now, Cade, Lucian, Darius, all half-dressed, all coiled with lethal fury. Elara's pulse stuttered. Because for the first time she wasn't sure who to trust. Not when there was a traitor among them. Not when someone had just tried to kill her. And not when Riven the rogue, the wild card, was the only one who had saved her. Act 3. The truth about Lunara. Elara was done. With the secrets. With the cryptic warnings. With the way every single person in this house looked at her like she was both a prize and a problem. She stormed into the war room, where all four alphas were already gathered: Cade standing like a tower of barely leashed fury, Lucien lounging like he was too damn entertained by her rage, Darius seated at the long wooden table, unreadable, and Riven looked downright amused. That only made her angrier. She slammed her hands down on the table, her voice vibrating with raw frustration. No more games. No more riddles. No more "you'll understand when the time is right" bullshit. I want the truth. Now. Lucien's crimson gaze flicked up to her, full of mocking amusement. Someone's in a mood. Her teeth clenched. Cade exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face, before narrowing those molten silver eyes on her. "What truth are you looking for, Elara?" she snorted. "Oh, I don't know, Cade. Maybe start with why someone tried to murder me last night while whispering about how I should have never returned." Silence. A heavy, thick silence. Darius leaned forward, his grey eyes giving away nothing. And what exactly did he say? Elara met his gaze, pulse hammering. He said I was never meant to return. She hesitated before adding, like my existence is a mistake. That silence stretched too long. Then Lucien spoke, his voice too calm. It's time she knows. Cade's muscles tensed, his fists tightening at his sides. Lucien. She deserves the truth, Lucien said smoothly, even if she's not ready for it. Elara bristled. I am standing right here, you arrogant ass. Lucien's lips curled slightly. Oh, we know. Cade growled low, but Lucien ignored him, shifting his attention fully to her. Elara, he said, his tone suddenly serious. Too serious. What do you actually remember about Lunara? Ilara's throat went dry. She didn't remember anything. Not really, just flashes. Fire, wolves, war. But deep down, something told her that whatever truth Lucien was about to spill, she wasn't going to like it. Lucien stood, moving to the large map spread across the table. He dragged a finger along its surface, stopping at a valley marked in red. This, he said, is where it all started. Ilara's stomach tightened. Lucien's voice was steady, almost detached. 1,000 years ago, the wolves lived as one. No packs, no divisions. Just a kingdom ruled by one leader, Lunara. Her breath caught. Only Lucien continued, his gaze flicking up to hers. She wasn't just a goddess, Elara. She wasn't just some benevolent queen. Ilara's fingers curled into fists. Lucien's voice dropped lower, softer. She was the one who divided us. Elara blinked. What? Lucien tilted his head slightly. You still don't get it, do you? Cade was stone still, his expression locked down so tightly it made her stomach turn. Riven had gone eerily silent, his smirk nowhere in sight. Darius didn't speak. Lucien leaned closer, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. Lunara didn't just rule the wolves, Elara. She cursed them. The words hit her like a punch to the ribs. Elara staggered back a step, her heartbeat a deafening roar in her ears. No, Lucien's crimson eyes gleamed. Yes. Cade let out a sharp breath, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Lunara's reign ended in blood and fire. She was betrayed by the very wolves she once led. Elara shook her head, rejecting every word. That's not no, you're wrong. Lucien's gaze hardened. Am I? Ilara's pulse thundered. Ashy memories flashed behind her eyes. A battlefield. Wolves turning on each other, claws ripping through flesh. The silver-haired goddess standing in the midst of it all, her power burning like the sun. You brought this upon yourself. Ilara's knees buckled, because suddenly she wasn't so sure they were lying. Silence stretched. Cade's gaze was fixed on the table, muscles tight with unspoken tension. Darius's grey eyes were locked on her, calculating. Riven wasn't smirking anymore. And that's what made her stomach twist the most. Elara forced a breath. Even if that's true, Lucien arched a brow. If, she scowled. Even if that's true, that was her. Not me. Lucien tilted his head. Was it? A cold weight settled in her chest. Cade finally lifted his head, his silver eyes unreadable. Elara, we don't know if, he hesitated, the words tasting like something bitter. If you came back to fix what she did, or to finish it. He didn't say the last part, but she heard it anyway. Something inside her fractured. You think I'm here to destroy you, she said flatly. None of them spoke. None of them denied it, and that hurt. More than she thought it would. Her jaw tightened. So what happens now? You keep me locked up. Wait and see if I turn into the big bad wolf. Darius's gaze never wavered. We watch. Elara let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Unbelievable. She turned away, but Cade's voice stopped her cold. Elara. She didn't face him. She didn't trust herself to. If it's true, Cade murmured, voice gruff. Then what will you do? Elara exhaled slowly, staring at the doorway, at the path that led to anywhere but here. I don't know, she admitted, and that was the problem. Because what if they were right? What if she really was the villain of this story? Elara wasn't snooping, not intentionally. She'd been pacing outside the study, needing space, needing air, needing something solid to hold on to after what she'd just learned about Lunara. The problem. There was nothing solid anymore. Everything was shifting, unraveling, leaving her dangling on the edge of something too big, too terrifying to accept. But then she heard them. The alphas. Low voices. Sharp words. And one voice, Darius's, cold as ice, cutting through the silence like a blade. We should have never brought her back. Elara froze. Her breath hitched, her pulse a wild, erratic drum in her chest. A pause. Then Cade's voice, tight, unreadable. You don't mean that. Darius exhaled slowly. She is Lunara. Lucian's voice darkened. She is Elara. Is she? Darius challenged, his words sharp enough to draw blood. She doesn't remember yet. But she will. And when she does, he cut himself off, then continued, quieter, more dangerous. What if she chooses power over peace? What if she finishes what she started? Silence. Thick, suffocating, suffused with doubt. Elara took a step back, numbness creeping through her limbs. They didn't trust her. They never had. She swallowed against the burning lump in her throat, chest aching with something raw, something sharp. Cade might have kissed her. Lucian might have teased her, soothed her, unsettled her. Riven might have saved her life. But at the end of the day, they still saw her as a threat. And maybe they were right. A crushing weight settled over her, pressing against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. She turned and ran. Elara barely registered the way her feet slammed against the forest floor, her breath sharp, ragged. The night air was cold, stinging her skin, but she didn't stop. She needed to get away. From the alphas. From their doubts. From the weight of a past she didn't ask for but couldn't escape. But she wasn't alone. The moment she crossed into the deep part of the woods, the moment the soft glow of the mansion disappeared behind the thick canopy of trees, the air shifted. It was subtle at first. The scent of pine and earth spoiled, tainted. The whisper of wind turned unnatural, wrong. Elara slowed, her instincts screaming at her, her muscles locking. A deep, low growl rumbled through the trees, not wolf. Something else, something older. She turned just in time to see the shadows move. A hand shot out of the darkness, clamping around her throat. She gasped, choked, hands flying up to claw at the iron grip crushing her windpipe. A voice, low, gravelly, steeped in centuries of power, slithered into her ear. You should have stayed dead, Lunara. Elara's vision blurred, her body writhing, twisting, but her captor was too strong, too fast. The shadows themselves seemed to thicken, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her into the dark. Her mind reeled, panic crashing through her veins like fire. No, not like this. But just as the world began to tilt, just as the icy tendrils of magic sank into her skin, a snarl. Fierce, violent, ravenous. Then impact. Elara was ripped from the shadows, the force sending her tumbling to the ground. She coughed, gasped for air, blinking hard as her vision cleared, and found Riven standing between her and the darkness. His chest was bare, his body coiled with lethal tension, his hazel eyes burning like wildfire. But it wasn't his usual cocky grin that met her. No, this was rage, unfiltered. Deadly. He let out a low, guttural growl, eyes locked on something in the shadows. Touch her again, he murmured, voice dripping with menace, and I'll tear you apart. A chuckle answered from the darkness, cold, amused, ancient. Ah, little wolves. Always so protective. But you can't protect her from herself. Elara's blood turned to ice. And then the shadows vanished, as if they had never been there, leaving behind only the lingering echo of the forgotten Alpha's voice. She belongs to me. A shiver crawled up her spine. Riven turned to her, his expression dark, unreadable. Elara, but she shook her head, throat tight, mind racing. The forgotten Alpha. The true villain. And he wanted her. Pain. white-hot, searing, endless. Elara's body arched off the cold stone floor, a scream tearing from her throat, raw and unrelenting. The power coiling around her wasn't just hurting her, it was unraveling her. The forgotten Alpha stood over her, his shadowed form barely visible in the inky blackness that stretched infinitely in all directions. His golden eyes glowed, not with warmth, but with something twisted, cold, hungry. "You were never meant to return," he murmured, his voice silken poison, layered with the weight of centuries of rage. Elara's breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, her fingers clawing at the stone, trying to ground herself. But there was nothing to hold on to. Nothing to keep her anchored as he peeled her apart. Her veins burned, her bones ached. The mate bond, the thread that tied her to them, shuddered, fraying at the edges. "No," she gasped, shaking her head, gritting her teeth through the agony. The forgotten Alpha crouched beside her, eerie amusement curling his lips. "Oh, little goddess," he whispered, reaching out, tracing a finger over her collarbone, and where he touched, her skin cracked like glass. "I am not killing you," he murmured. "I am setting you free." And then he dug his fingers into her chest. Elara screamed. White-hot agony surged through her, an unnatural force clawing into her very soul, pulling, ripping, tearing her apart. Cade ran, faster than he ever had before, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming, but he didn't stop. Neither did the others. Lucian was at his side, his crimson eyes brimming with violence, his usual smirk nowhere in sight. Riven, the fastest of them all, was already shifting, his wolf form a blur of hazel and gold, teeth bared in a silent promise of blood. Darius controlled, ruthless Darius had power crackling at his fingertips, his rage a quiet, lethal thing. They had wasted time, doubted, questioned. They had let her go, and now she was suffering for it. Cade wouldn't forgive himself, would never forgive himself. Not unless they got to her. Not unless they ripped apart the bastard who had dared to take her. And when they finally burst into the clearing, when they saw her, Elara, on her knees, trembling, broken, her body cracking like fragile porcelain, her eyes wide and unseeing, Cade's vision went red. The forgotten Alpha stood behind her, his hands still hovering over her chest, his golden eyes flicking up, amusement curling his lips. "You're too late," he mused. Cade didn't think. He lunged. Elara felt them. The mate bond, it surged, pulsing with a desperate, violent pull. She could hear them, Cade's roar of fury, Lucian's sharp snarl, Riven's low, guttural growl, Darius's icy command that cracked through the air. They were here. They came for her. Her breath hitched, her body trembling, the forgotten Alpha's grip tightening around her soul. "No," she whispered, her fingers clawing at the stone, fighting, but it was too late. The forgotten Alpha smiled, and he snapped the bond. A vicious, invisible blade sliced through her chest, through her ribs, through the very essence of what tied her to them. And for the first time since she met them, since she had been found, claimed, tangled in their world, she felt nothing. The tether to Cade, gone. The pull toward Lucian, gone. The warmth of Riven, gone. The quiet certainty of Darius, gone. Everything vanished. Elara's breath shattered. She collapsed forward, her hands slamming against the stone, her vision darkening at the edges. No. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She lifted her head, her lips parting, but her voice wouldn't come. She was slipping, sinking into the dark, and the last thing she heard before the void took her completely was Cade's furious, agonized roar. Act 4, choosing her mates. Darkness. It stretched infinitely in every direction, thick and absolute, swallowing sound, swallowing light, swallowing her. Elara didn't know if she was floating or falling, if she was dead or somewhere caught in between. She had no body, no form, just a mind, an awareness drifting in an endless void. And then a voice. Soft but impossibly strong. "You are not lost, child." Elara spun. Or maybe the world shifted around her because suddenly she wasn't alone. A figure stood before her, tall, radiant, too ethereal to be human. Her hair was pure silver, cascading in shimmering waves, her eyes an endless, glowing blue-white, filled with galaxies. Power pulsed around her, curling at her feet like silver mist, and when she moved, the void itself seemed to bend to her will. Elara knew her. Had always known her. "Lunara," she whispered. The woman, the goddess, tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You remember me?" Elara's pulse thundered, though she wasn't sure she even had a heart anymore. "I remember," her throat closed. "I remember what they said, that I cursed them, that I destroyed them." Lunara's gaze didn't waver. "Do you believe them?" Elara's breath caught. I don't know." Lunara stepped closer, her presence a force, a weight, an unshakable thing. "Then let me show you." The darkness shattered, and suddenly Elara was standing in a different time. A memory of war, the battlefield stretched endlessly before her, the sky above choked with smoke, the ground drenched in blood. Wolves lay scattered, their bodies twisted, broken. Elara sucked in a breath, panic rising in her throat, because she recognized this place. The visions. The nightmares. This was it. This was the war that had changed everything. Lunara stood beside her, watching, her expression unreadable. "Look." Elara turned and saw herself, or rather the version of her that came before. Lunara, the goddess, the ruler, the warrior, stood at the heart of the battlefield, her silver hair whipping in the wind, her body bathed in light and blood. Power crackled around her like a living thing, a force so overwhelming, so devastatingly immense, that the air itself hummed with it. And in front of her, on his knees, a man. No, a wolf, massive, dark, golden-eyed, and dying. Elara's stomach dropped, because she knew him. The forgotten Alpha. He looked weakened, his body failing, but his eyes, they burned with hatred, with betrayal. Lunara lifted a hand wreathed in silver fire, and when she spoke, her voice was a command, an undeniable decree. "You will never rule again." The forgotten Alpha's growl rattled the earth. "You betrayed us." Lunara didn't flinch. "I saved us." A vicious snarl ripped from his throat, and then she struck. The curse left her fingers in a flash of silver-white energy, slamming into the forgotten Alpha, into the land itself, into every single wolf on that battlefield. Elara felt it. Felt the way the magic embedded itself into their souls, felt the way it split them, divided them, ensured they would never again stand as one. She had done this. She had been judge, jury, and executioner, and now she was paying the price. The vision faded, and suddenly she was back in the void. The choice that will change everything. Elara staggered back, her pulse racing. Her gaze snapped to Lunara. "I did it." Her voice cracked. "I really did it." Lunara's silver blue eyes softened. "Yes." Elara's chest ached, her mind spinning. "Then they're right. I'm a monster." "I know." The word was spoken with such finality, such undeniable truth, that Elara froze. Lunara stepped forward, placing a cool hand against Elara's racing heart. "You did what you had to," the goddess murmured. "But the curse was never meant to last forever." Elara's breath hitched. Lunara's gaze locked onto hers. "You can break it." Elara's stomach twisted. "How?" Lunara cupped her face, her thumbs brushing against Elara's cheekbones, and for the first time, her eyes filled with something like sorrow. "By embracing what you are." Elara's throat tightened. "I don't know how," she admitted. Lunara's expression softened. "You will." The void shifted. The darkness thinned. Elara felt herself being pulled away, back to the real world, back to the ones waiting for her, but Lunara's final words echoed in her mind. "You are not the villain, Elara, but you are the only one who can stop him." And then she woke up. Pain. Sharp, jagged, unforgiving. It licked along her skin, coiling inside her bones, curling around her fractured soul like a beast with razor-sharp teeth. Elara gasped, her back arching off the cold stone floor, a violent tremor rippling through her body. Everything felt wrong. Too much. Too alive. Her senses were razor-sharp, heightened beyond anything human, beyond even what they had been before. She felt the air shift around her, every particle moving, every heartbeat in the room like a drum in her ears. She felt the weight of the earth beneath her, the moon's pull above her, the threads of fate stretching and twisting with every fractured breath. A presence loomed near her, familiar, frantic. "Elara." Cade's voice, rough, desperate. Elara's vision snapped into focus. He knelt beside her, his silver eyes wide, his hand hovering over her skin like he was afraid to touch her. Afraid she might break, or worse, afraid she wasn't her anymore. The other Alpha stood behind him, their faces etched with something close to awe, close to fear. Lucian, for once, wasn't smirking. His crimson gaze flicked over her, sharp and searching. Riven's usual playfulness had vanished, replaced with a kind of reverent silence. And Darius, always composed, always unreadable, stood utterly still, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something he hadn't yet named. Elara sucked in a shaking breath. The moment her lungs filled, power roared through her. Silver light burst from beneath her skin, crackling along her arms, dancing at her fingertips like fire and stardust. Her body hummed, the glow spreading, pulsing alive in a way she had never felt before. Elara's lips parted, her fingers pressing against her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just awake, she was different. Her power no longer a whisper, no longer a sleeping beast waiting to be called. It was awake. She was awake. "Elara," Cade said again, voice thick with something raw, something fraying at the edges. She turned to him, and the moment her gaze met his, she felt it. The mate bond. Only it wasn't what it had been before. It wasn't a thread anymore. It was a chain, stronger, unbreakable. The moment she realized it, Cade sucked in a sharp breath, his pupils dilating, his fingers twitching at his sides. "You feel it, don't you?" Lucian murmured, his crimson eyes flickering with something unnerving. Elara swallowed hard, every nerve in her body lit up, aware, awake. "Yes," she whispered, because she did. She felt everything. The mate bond thicker, heavier, no longer just a pull but an undeniable, cosmic force. The wolves, not just her alphas, but the entire pack, their energy humming in the air, their emotions brushing against her senses. The moon full, waiting, whispering ancient truths through her veins. Her head tilted back, her eyes fluttering shut, and she let it come. Let the power fill her, surge through her, reshape her. And then, when she opened her eyes, the room gasped. Lucian cursed under his breath, because her eyes, her once human eyes, were no longer the same. They glowed. They glowed. Not with gold, not with red, not with silver, but with pure moonlight. Cade exhaled slowly, his voice hoarse, awed, wrecked. "Goddess." And this time he wasn't just calling her that, he was speaking the truth. Elara had become what she was always meant to be. The moon goddess had returned. The forgotten alpha laughed. Low, mocking. Like he still believed he had already won. Like the battle was over. Like she was still the weak, broken girl he had dragged into the shadows, waiting to be erased. Elara's fingers curled into fists, silver light flickering along her skin, alive, restless, deadly. Because she was not broken. Not anymore. Not ever again. The forgotten alpha circled her, his golden eyes gleaming, his lips curling into a smug, knowing smile. "You don't even know what you are." Elara lifted her chin. "I do now." His smile widened. "Then you should already know you can't win." A low, rumbling growl filled the air behind her. Not just one. 4. Cade, brimming with fury. Lucian, sharp, unreadable but ready to kill. Riven. Muscles tensed, his wolf pacing just beneath the surface. Darius, cool and lethal, but his anger was a blade, waiting for the moment to strike. They were all here, but they weren't the ones he should fear. Not anymore. Elara inhaled slowly, feeling the power in her veins like a living thing. She wasn't the frightened girl pleading for control. She was the moon goddess reborn, and she was done playing by anyone else's rules. The forgotten alpha moved. Fast. Too fast. A blur of shadows rushing toward her, reaching, ready to consume. Elara lifted a hand, and the world ignited. A pulse of raw, unfiltered power exploded from her palm, slamming into him, the force so fierce, so devastating that the ground itself shuddered. The forgotten alpha let out a snarl, not of pain, but of shock, because he had never expected her to fight back, to match him, to exceed him. He lunged again, faster, but she was faster. The moment his hand reached for her throat, she caught it, topped it, held it. And for the first time, his confidence cracked. His eyes widened. Impossible. Elara's grip tightened, silver light surging along her fingers, burning through him. "Not impossible," she whispered. "I am stronger than you." The forgotten alpha let out a furious roar, shadows writhing, twisting, trying to consume her whole. But she didn't let them. Didn't let him. She closed her eyes. Reached deep, deeper. To the very place where the curse had been woven into the wolves' souls. to the moment she had made it. And she undid it. The shadows around him snapped. The golden glow in his eyes flickered. And then the curse unraveled. A deep, vicious snarl tore from his throat as he fell to his knees, his form disintegrating, coming apart like dust in the wind. "No," he gasped, his body splintering, breaking, vanishing. Elara stared down at him, voice quiet, steady. "Yes." And then he was gone. Erased, destroyed. The curse lifted. The night went silent. And in that breath, in that single shuddering heartbeat, she knew it was over. The forgotten Alpha was dead. And she had won. The battlefield was silent. No wind. No howling wolves. No whispers of the forgotten curse that had hung over them for centuries. Only the distant crackling of dissipating magic, the scent of scorched earth, and the faint sound of labored breathing. Elara stood at the center of it all, her body humming with untamed power, silver light still flickering along her fingertips. The weight of what she had just done pressed down on her. The forgotten Alpha was gone, but the real battle was only beginning, because now she had to face them. She turned slowly, her moonlit gaze falling on the four wolves who had doubted her, who had feared her, who had, in their own way, betrayed her. Cade was the first to meet her eyes, wounded, bleeding, but alive, barely. His silver gaze was raw, haunted, his breathing uneven, his hand pressed against a wound at his ribs that refused to heal fast enough. Lucian was next, his usual arrogance stripped away, replaced with something almost uncertain. His crimson eyes flickered with an emotion she couldn't name, his lips parted like he wanted to say something but didn't trust himself to. Riven, for once, had nothing to smirk about. His face was tight, unreadable, his usual reckless confidence buried beneath the weight of what he had almost lost. And Darius, controlled, calculating Darius, looked at her like he was finally seeing her for what she was. Not a threat, not a pawn in some political war, but something else entirely, something more. Elara lifted her chin, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You thought I was the enemy." No one spoke. She took a step forward, the ground cracking slightly beneath her bare feet, a silver glow flaring just enough to remind them that she was no longer the girl they had first found. "I would have died for you," she continued, voice sharper now, cutting through the silence like a blade. "And you left me, you doubted me." A harsh breath. Then Cade dropped to his knees. His head bowed, his shoulders tight, his entire body radiating anguish and regret. "Elara!" His voice was hoarse, rough, wrecked. "We were wrong." Lucian inhaled sharply, then followed, falling to one knee, his head tilting back as he let out a humorless, broken laugh. "Goddess!" "I never thought I'd be begging," he muttered. "But here we are." Riven exhaled through his nose, looking up at her with something dangerously close to reverence, before lowering himself to the ground, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. And Darius, who had always held himself above submission, above showing anything beyond cold efficiency, was the last to kneel. His jaw clenched, his pride fought it, but still he sank, still he bowed his head. And suddenly the mate bond, the one that had been severed, the one that had left her broken and hollow, snapped back into place. Stronger. Unbreakable. Because they weren't just kneeling to her as their mate. They were kneeling to her as their goddess. Elara's throat tightened, because she had spent so long fighting them. Fighting fate. Fighting herself. But maybe fate wasn't the enemy. Maybe the real battle had always been letting them in. She took a slow, shaking breath, stepping toward them, her voice soft but absolute. "Stand," she commanded, and they did, not as Alpha's, but as hers. Elara felt them before she saw them. The mate bond, newly reforged, stronger than ever, pulled at her, their emotions crashing into her like a tidal wave. Regret, longing, hunger, fear, they wanted her. But she wasn't about to make this easy. She stood in the moonlit courtyard, the cool night air whispering through the trees, her silver glow still humming beneath her skin. She had destroyed the forgotten Alpha. She had lifted the curse. But one truth remained. If they were going to be hers truly, completely hers, they had to earn it. Cade, Lucian, Riven, Darius. 4 Alphas. 4 wolves who had doubted her, who had tried to control her, who had failed her in one way or another. They knelt for her once. Now they would have to prove they deserved to stand at her side. Elara's gaze swept over them, heart steady, voice unwavering. "This isn't a game," she said, holding each of their eyes. "I won't be owned. I won't be controlled. And if you want me, you'll have to prove that you can be mine just as much as I can be yours." A beat of silence. Then Cade stepped forward. Cade, the alpha who must let go. Cade's silver eyes were unreadable, his hands clenching at his sides. She had always felt him, his presence, his dominance, the weight of his control pressing against her like a hand at the back of her neck. But tonight she needed something different. "You've always tried to lead me," Elara murmured, tilting her head. "Always tried to control me. But if you want me, Cade, you have to show me that you can follow." His jaw ticked, conflict flashing through his gaze. He stepped closer, towering over her, but didn't touch. Didn't demand. Didn't take. Instead, he waited. His throat bobbed. "Tell me what you need." Elara's stomach tightened, her fingers itching to touch him, but she held still. "Kiss me," she whispered, "but let me lead." Cade inhaled sharply. She saw the war raging in him, the instinct to command, the need to possess. But when she rose onto her toes, when she let her fingers trace along his jaw, his lips parted on a shuddered breath, he let her take control. Let her set the pace. Her lips brushed over his. A slow, teasing promise, waiting, and when he didn't push, when he didn't grab her, when he let her decide, she kissed him. It was slow, deep, torturous in its restraint, a surrender but not of power, of trust. When she pulled back, Cade was breathing hard, his hands trembling at his sides. "Did I pass?" he rasped. A small smile touched her lips. "For now." Lucien, the alpha who must trust. Lucien's crimson gaze was darker than usual, his smirk nowhere in sight. She had never seen him uncertain. Until now. "You trust no one," she said simply. He let out a humorless chuckle. "And you expect me to start now?" "Yes." Lucien exhaled through his nose. "How?" Elara took a step forward, heart pounding. "Let me blindfold you." His eyes snapped to hers. "Let me touch you," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "Let me control the moment. Let yourself be vulnerable." For the first time, Lucien hesitated. She could feel it, his need for control, for power. The way he used his teasing, his smirks, his wicked tongue as armor. But he let her tie the silk around his eyes. Let her take away his sight. His breath hitched when she traced her fingers down his chest, when she kissed the corner of his lips, but didn't give him more. His entire body was coiled like a spring, tense, waiting, shaking, but he didn't break, didn't pull off the blindfold, didn't try to take control. When she pulled back, he let out a ragged breath, his throat working. And in that moment she knew. Lucien would always push her, always challenge her, but he would also trust her, because he just had. Riven, the alpha who must surrender his walls, Riven, stood with his arms crossed, his usual cocky smirk nowhere to be found. "I let you in," she said softly. "But you never let me in." Something flashed in his gaze. Elara stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest, feeling the wild thunder of his heartbeat. "Show me what's underneath," she murmured. "No jokes, no distractions, just you." Riven's throat bobbed. Then, slowly he placed a hand over his heart, his fingers curled around hers, pressing it against his bare skin. "Do you feel that?" he murmured. Her stomach twisted. "Yes, that's you, Elara," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "It's always been you." A slow, aching warmth spread through her chest, and when he leaned in, not grinning, not teasing, just raw and open, she met him halfway. Kissing him felt like falling, like being caught before she hit the ground. When she pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "You already have me," he whispered. And she knew it was true. Darius. The alpha who must believe in fate. Darius watched her, still, calculating, unreadable. For him, this had never been about control. It had been about logic, about facts. He never believed in fate, not until her. Elara held his gaze. "You wanted proof." Darius's jaw tightened. Yes, she took his hand, pressing it against her glowing skin. "Then feel it." His fingers tensed, then softened. The air between them hummed, crackling with energy, with something undeniable, unstoppable. Darius's eyes darkened, his breath slowing, and finally he whispered, "I believe." Elara's chest ached. She lifted his hand to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. "Then you're mine," she murmured. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Always." The choice. Elara stepped back, her gaze sweeping over all of them, her mates, her alphas. "Hers, then I choose you," she whispered, voice steady, absolute. The mate bond shuddered, then locked into place. Final. Eternal. Cade exhaled, his lips parting in relief and devotion. Lucian's smirk returned, but softer. Riven grinned, this time without walls. And Darius, the one who had fought fate the hardest, bowed his head. And in that moment she knew. They were hers, and she was theirs. Forever. The air was thick with tension, charged with something old and primal, something that had always been there, waiting, aching, pulling them together. The mate bond hummed at the edges, flickering like an untamed flame, raw and unformed, a thread waiting to be woven back together. Elara stood at the center of them, her alphas. Cade, Lucian, Riven, Darius. They had passed her trials. They had proven their devotion, their trust, their surrender. Now she would claim them. Again. But this time on her terms. She stepped forward, her silver glow casting soft shadows over their faces. They watched her with rapt focus, with hunger, with something too deep to name. Cade's silver eyes were molten, his hands twitching at his sides, his dominance tempered but not erased. Lucian's lips curled at the edges, but his crimson gaze was unguarded, open, waiting. Riven, always the smirking rogue, was silent for once, his hazel eyes burning with something he never let anyone see. And Darius, stoic, logical Darius, looked at her like she was something holy, something irrefutable. Elara inhaled deeply, letting the bond swell inside her. She lifted her hands, silver light sparking from her fingertips, curling around the four of them like ghostly ribbons. "Do you accept me?" she whispered. Cade stepped forward first, his voice low, steady. "Absolute. I was yours from the moment I saw you." Elara lifted her hand, placing it against his bare chest, right over his heart. His breath hitched. Lucian stepped up next, his lips twitching in the ghost of a smirk, but his voice was raw. "I trust you, goddess. I always will." Her fingers traced up his neck, cupping his jaw, and his eyes fluttered shut, like he was absorbing the moment, letting it sink in. Riven exhaled roughly, stepping in next. His gaze flicked over her face, his voice a little hoarse. "You already know I belong to you. Always." Elara pressed her palm to his chest, right over his racing pulse. Darius was the last to move, slow, deliberate, his jaw tight as he searched her eyes. "I believe in you," he murmured, the words not just an admission but a vow. A slow, soft smile curved her lips. "Then take me," she whispered. And the mate bond snapped into place. It wasn't just a thread rejoining. It was a collision, an explosion, a storm crashing through them all at once. Cade let out a ragged groan, his hands coming up to grip her hips, grounding himself. Lucian's breath stuttered, his fingers curling around her wrist, like he needed to hold on. Riven shuddered, pressing his forehead against her temple, his breath uneven. And Darius, cold, logical Darius, let out a slow, shaky exhale, his fingers flexing like he had no idea how to handle this level of raw, unfiltered feeling. Elara felt all of them, their emotions slamming into her like a force of nature. Cade's fierce, unwavering devotion. Lucian's silent surrender. Riven's unrestrained, desperate hunger. Darius's calm, absolute certainty. She let the bond settle, let it root deep, let it weave them together into something unbreakable. Then she lifted her chin, her silver eyes glowing with moonlight. "Mine," she whispered. Their growls of agreement echoed into the night, and this time they didn't just belong to her. She belonged to them too. Forever. The moon hung high and full, casting its silver glow over the clearing, illuminating Elara and her alphas as they stood before the gathered packs. Thousands of wolves had come, not just from Blackwood's lands, not just from the neighboring territories. All of them. Every pack that had been bound by the curse. Every wolf who had been shaped, broken, and divided by a goddess's mistake. By her mistake. And tonight it would end. Elara inhaled deeply, the cool night air filling her lungs, the weight of the mate bond stronger than ever, pulsing between her and her alphas like a living thing. Cade, ever strong, ever steadfast, stood at her right, his silver eyes locked onto her with something close to reverence. Lucian, all sharp angles and wicked smirks, was unusually quiet, his crimson gaze soft in a way she wasn't sure he realized. Riven, who had spent his entire life running from fate, was standing still now, his body pressed against hers like he never intended to move again. And Darius, the one who had doubted the hardest, believed now. She could feel it in the way he stood beside her, solid, unwavering, unshaken. They were hers. and she was theirs. But this moment, this final act, was for the wolves. Elara stepped forward, her silver glow brightening, power unfurling from her like mist rolling across the land. The pack stilled, watching, waiting. Some were afraid, some were desperate, some most were simply ready. She spread her hands, feeling the energy thrumming beneath the earth, the pulse of the moon, the bones of the past whispering in the wind. The curse had been woven into their kind, embedded in their souls. But she wasn't the same woman who had done it, and she wouldn't let them suffer any longer. Elara lifted her gaze to the sky, letting her power build, sharpen, rise. Her voice rang through the night, echoing across the mountains, across the forests, across the hearts of every wolf in the world. By my will, by my blood, by the power of the moon, I undo what was done. No more curses. No more divisions. No more chains. The moment the words left her lips, the earth trembled. Wolves cried out, falling to their knees, clutching at their chests as the weight, the invisible, ancient weight that had bound them, snapped. The bond that had divided packs, the old wounds that had kept them in conflict, in war, in endless cycles of betrayal and fear, gone. The magic shattered, and the air itself shook with it. And then silence, a silence so pure, so deep, so absolute, that Elara felt it in her bones. She released a slow, shaking breath. It was done. The wolves were free. A breath of wind rushed through the clearing, carrying new scents, new futures, new beginnings. And then, slowly, one by one, the wolves lifted their heads and howled. It started as a single call, then another, then 100 more, and then thousands. A chorus of voices, a symphony of rebirth, of unity, of something new. The world had changed, and Elara had changed it. Cade's arms wrapped around her waist, his forehead pressing to the back of her neck, his breath hot, reverent, grounding. Lucien's hand curled around hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, a silent promise, a silent vow. Riven pressed a kiss to her shoulder, his lips lingering, his heart steady beneath his ribs. And Darius, who had fought the hardest, believed the least, rested his forehead against her temple and whispered, "You did it." Elara smiled, because this time, for the first time in centuries, the wolves were whole. And so was she. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light over the small clearing where Elara and her mate sat, the air warm, rich with the scent of pine and home. A home she had found in them. A home she had created for their people. Lucien stretched, sighing dramatically as he leaned back against the log. "So, does this make us royalty now? Because if so, I demand a crown," Cade groaned. "Lucien what?" Lucien smirked, nudging Riven, who snorted. "I think we deserve some recognition, considering we're now mated to the most powerful being in existence." Darius rolled his eyes. "We don't need titles," Lucien smirked. "Fine, then I'll settle for regular worship." Elara laughed, shaking her head. She loved them. Fiercely, completely, even when they were infuriating. Especially when they were infuriating. Cade tugged her into his lap, his arms tightening around her waist, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin beneath her ear. "Happy," he murmured. Elara exhaled slowly, letting herself relax against him, against all of them. "Complete," Lucien groaned. "Ugh, too sweet. Someone ruined the moment," Riven smirked. "I could take my shirt off." Darius sighed. "You're incorrigible," Lucien grinned, "and yet you love me." Elara let out a breathless laugh, the sound swallowed by the crisp night air, by the safety of the bond, by the knowledge that the world, her world, was exactly as it should be. Finally. At peace. The air was thick with anticipation. The moon hung high, full and watchful, casting its pale glow over the gathered wolves. The land pulsed with new magic, free from the ancient chains that had bound them for centuries. But tonight wasn't just about freedom. Tonight they would choose, and the wolves, thousands of them, gathered from every pack, already knew who they would kneel for. Elara stood at the center of the clearing, her silver glow flickering softly along her skin, the power of the moon humming inside her veins. She could feel them watching. Waiting. She wasn't just their savior, she was their future. The packs shifted, alphas and betas exchanging glances, uncertainty laced with reverence. Cade stepped closer, his voice a low, steady command. "Kneel." The word rippled through the night like a command from the moon itself. Silence stretched for a beat. Then one wolf, an older alpha with battle-worn scars, was the first to move. He bent onto one knee, his head bowed. Then another, and another. A chain reaction. Thousands of wolves sinking onto their knees, baring their throats in submission, in devotion, in trust. Elara's breath hitched. She had never wanted power, had never asked to rule. But this wasn't about control. It was about guidance. Protection. Unity. Lucien whistled low beside her. Well, if that isn't the sexiest thing I've ever seen. Riven smirked. But even he looked affected. You're not wrong. Darius remained quiet, but his gaze softened, the weight of this moment settling over him. Cade stood at her side, his silver eyes locked onto hers, a slow smile pulling at his lips. You're not just their goddess, he murmured. You're their queen. The title sent a thrill through her, not of fear but of absolute certainty. Because they were right. The wolves had chosen her, she was theirs, and they were hers. She lifted her chin, stepping forward, letting her power spread through the crowd, a soft, steady pulse of warmth and strength. Rise, she commanded, her voice ringing clear and unshaken. The wolves obeyed. Heads lifted, eyes glowed, hearts pounded in unison. One pack, one people, one future. And at the center of it all, Elara, their goddess, their queen, their alpha of alphas. And as the wind carried the echoes of their howls into the night, she knew this was just the beginning. The world had changed. The curse was broken. The wolves had knelt before her, accepted her as not just their goddess, not just their ruler, but their queen. But now it was time for her mates to claim her. Not as their leader, not as their goddess, but as their mate. Elara stood in the heart of their territory, deep within the forest, where the air was thick with pine, earth, and the scent of home. The moonlight filtered through the trees, painting her skin in silver, her heart hammering as she felt them. Her alphas. Her wolves. Hers. They surrounded her, powerful and predatory, their presence electric against her senses. Cade's silver eyes burned with fierce possession, his stance strong, unyielding as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. Lucien's crimson gaze flickered with wicked heat, a smirk on his lips, but something raw and reverent in his expression. Riven, the rogue who had spent his life laughing in the face of fate, now stood before her with a quiet devotion that unraveled her. And Darius the cold, calculating alpha had surrendered entirely, his hands clenched at his sides, his body taut with the silent weight of what she meant to him. The mate bond thrummed, pulling them together, tighter, unbreakable, absolute. Cade moved first. Always the first to act, always the first to lead. He closed the distance between them, his fingers trailing up her arm, sending a shiver skittering down her spine. You belong to us, he murmured, voice rough, full of need, full of certainty. Elara lifted her chin, heat curling deep in her belly. And you belong to me. Something dark and satisfied flashed in his eyes. Lucien was next, his touch featherlight, teasing, his lips brushing over her bare shoulder, sending warmth spiraling through her. Forever, goddess, he whispered, his voice smooth, sinful. Riven grinned, his hands sliding around her waist, his breath hot against her neck. You sure you can handle all of us, sweetheart? Elara smirked, tilting her head just enough that her lips brushed his. Try me. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but it was Darius who sealed their fate. He cupped her jaw, tilting her face up, his grey eyes full of unspoken promises, unshakable devotion. We claim you, he murmured, his breath a whisper against her lips. As you claim us. Elara's heart pounded, her blood singing, her entire body trembling with the force of the bond. Yes, she whispered, her voice steady, absolute, and the moment she spoke, the mate bond roared to life. It locked into place, not just a thread, but a golden chain, unbreakable, eternal, woven from power, devotion, and something deeper than fate. A gasp tore from her throat, heat flooding through her, a rush of energy so intense, so all-consuming, she swore the earth trembled beneath her feet. Cade's grip tightened. Lucien let out a ragged breath. Riven cursed under his breath, his forehead pressing against her shoulder. Darius exhaled slowly, his jaw tight, his hand shaking. And then they were whole. Forever bound. Forever theirs. Elara let out a slow, satisfied breath, her fingers curling around Cade's shirt, pulling him closer. Mine, she murmured, his eyes darkened, a growl rumbling in his chest. Always. Lucien laughed softly, brushing his lips against her temple. Riven nipped at her throat, smug as ever. Darius's arms wrapped around her from behind, his breath steady, solid, grounding. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other, the world still humming with the remnants of the magic that had made them one, Elara knew one undeniable truth. This was her future. Her wolves, her mates, her forever. And no force, not fate, not gods, not war would ever tear them apart again.